The check was so large I needed both arms to hold it steady, and even then the wind off Lake Ontario kept trying to fold it in half. Lotto Max. 41 million after the Canada Revenue Agency took its share. Which, lucky for me, was nothing, because lottery winnings aren't taxed in this country. A fact the OLG representative repeated twice for the cameras like it was a punchline. I stood there in my good wool coat, the one I'd had since my retirement from the rail yard, and I smiled the way you smile when your face has forgotten how. "Harold, you're the luckiest man in Ontario," the reporter said. "What's the first thing you're going to do?" "Pay off my mortgage," I said, and people laughed like I was being modest. I wasn't being modest. I genuinely didn't know what else to say. 68 years old, 40 years working freight lines out of Hamilton, and not once in that whole stretch had anyone ever asked me what I wanted to buy. "Do you have family to celebrate with?" That one landed wrong the way a step lands wrong when you misjudge the curb. I held the smile. "I have what I need," I said, which was a sentence built entirely out of avoidance. What I had was a daughter named Reagan who hadn't called me in 14 years. Not since the funeral. Not since the argument at the funeral, the one where she told me I'd never once shown up for her the way I should have, and I told her she didn't know the first thing about what I'd given up to keep food on that table. And she walked to her car, and that was that. 14 Christmases. 14 birthdays. I used to mark her birthday on the calendar every year out of some stubborn habit, like a man still setting a place at the table for someone who'd moved across the country. The money landed in my account 3 business days later. $41 million, sitting in a Royal Bank checking account that had never in its life held more than 11,000. I sat in my kitchen in Hamilton that night with my laptop open, the cursor blinking next to the number, and I felt the way I used to feel standing on the platform when a train came in faster than scheduled, like something enormous was bearing down, and I had about 4 seconds to decide whether to step back. The next morning I drove downtown and asked for whoever handled accounts like this. A young man named, it doesn't matter what his name was, I never could keep it straight, something with too many syllables, sat me down in a glass office on the 9th floor and spent the first 10 minutes congratulating me before his voice changed register, the way a doctor's voice changes when the test results come back. "Mr. Voss, with an amount like this, you'll want to think seriously about protecting yourself. Family members come out of the woodwork. People you haven't heard from in years suddenly remember they love you." I told him I'd spent 40 years moving freight across this country, and I understood risk better than most men understood their own children. He didn't laugh. He set up a trust for me anyway, a numbered company to hold the house I was about to buy. Language about discretionary distributions that I signed without fully reading, because by that point I just wanted to go home and sit in my own kitchen, which still smelled like the same instant coffee I'd been drinking for 30 years, in a life that no longer matched the number on my bank statement. I bought a house outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. Not a mansion. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story people imagine always involves marble floors and a circular driveway, and mine wasn't that. It was a good stone house on 4 acres, vineyard country, a view of the escarpment that made my chest hurt in a way I didn't have a word for. I bought it because the realtor said the previous owners had raised 4 kids there, and something about that detail got under my skin. I moved in alone. I hired a woman named Priya twice a week to help with the cleaning because the house was too big for one old man and his bad knees. Most evenings I sat on the back porch with a glass of rye and watched the light change over the vines and thought about how strange it was to have everything and nobody to give it to. It took 11 weeks for the world to find me. 11 weeks of silence after the lottery announcement, and then a knock at my door on a Tuesday evening in October, the kind of evening where the air smells like wet leaves and wood smoke, and you can feel the lake weather coming. I opened the door and my daughter was standing on my porch with 2 suitcases. I want to be honest about what happened in my chest in that moment, because the honest thing isn't simple. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was 14 years collapsing into about 4 seconds. She looked older. Of course she looked older, we all do. But she looked older in a tired way, not a graceful way, and some part of me that I'm not proud of immediately cataloged that as worry rather than warmth. Standing slightly behind her was a man I'd never met, broad through the shoulders, wearing a leather jacket that looked too expensive for the rest of him, and behind both of them, idling in my driveway, was a rented SUV with Ontario plates, and a third figure I didn't recognize sitting in the passenger seat. "Dad," Reagan said. 14 years, and that was the word she chose, like it still belonged to her. "Reagan, can we come in? It's freezing." I should have said no. I knew it even then, standing in the doorway with the porch light throwing long shadows across her face, some instinct that had nothing to do with logistics or freight schedules, some older and simpler instinct, was telling me this was the moment to close the door gently and say we'd talk on the phone. But I didn't listen to it. I stepped back and let her in, and her husband followed, and behind him the man from the passenger seat, who turned out to be her father-in-law, a heavy-set man named Roland who shook my hand too hard and called the house quite the spread before he'd even taken his coat off. They sat in my living room, my dead wife's good armchairs, the ones I'd had reupholstered after she passed, and Reagan cried, "I want to give her that." The tears looked real. She talked about how sorry she was, about how grief does strange things to people, about how she'd thought about calling me 100 times over the years and never found the courage, and every word of it might even have been true. I sat across from her with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea I wasn't drinking, feeling 14 years of carefully built distance softening like ice on the first warm day of spring, and some part of me, the part that still remembered teaching her to ride a bike on Barton Street, the part that still kept her birthday marked on a calendar nobody else looked at, wanted so badly to believe her that I let myself. It was her husband who moved first. "We've actually been talking," he said, setting down his coffee, "about logistics. With a place this size, it doesn't make sense for it to just be you rattling around in it." He smiled in a way that didn't reach anything behind his eyes. "We figured we'd come stay for a while, help out. There's got to be, 5 bedrooms? We'll take the east wing." The east wing. As though my house had wings. As though he'd already walked it, measured it, assigned it. And obviously, Roland added, leaning forward with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once in his life been told no, "We should talk about putting some of this on paper. Family money should stay organized. Trusts, succession, that kind of thing. I do a bit of this professionally, actually, so I'd be happy to help structure things properly." I looked at my daughter. I was looking for some flicker of discomfort, some sign that she found this as strange as I did. 2 men she'd brought into my home discussing my estate before they'd finished their first cup of coffee. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the floor, twisting her wedding ring, and I understood in that moment, the way you understand a freight schedule is wrong before you've even checked the numbers, just from the wrongness of the rhythm, that this had been discussed in the car on the drive up from Toronto, probably discussed for weeks before that. "You're welcome to stay the night," I said carefully. "It's late, the roads are bad. We can talk tomorrow. We brought our things," Reagan's husband said, gesturing at the suitcases by the door, and something in the way he said it. "We brought our things, present tense, settled, finished. Told me this was never meant to be a visit. This was a move. I let them stay that first night. I told myself it was decency, and maybe it was, but I think now it was also fear. Fear that if I said no, I'd lose her again, this time permanently, and some stubborn old part of me still wasn't ready to bury that hope. The next morning I came downstairs to find Roland in my kitchen with my financial advisor's business card in his hand. He'd found it on the counter and called the number before I'd even had coffee. "Just introducing myself," he said cheerfully. "Figured it'd save time." That was the day I stopped being confused and started paying attention. Over the next week, I watched my house get quietly redistributed without anyone asking my permission. Reagan's husband, his name was Dustin, and I made myself learn it properly because I had a feeling I'd need to say it to a lawyer eventually, started referring to our property within 4 days. He walked the vineyard with a tablet, taking photos, talking about potential for a wedding venue business, real growth opportunity, Dad. You'd basically be sitting on a gold mine. He called me Dad. I'd known him 5 days. Roland, meanwhile, had appointed himself my financial advisor. He brought over a folder of paperwork just to look at, numbered company structures that, on closer reading one night after they'd gone to bed, would have folded my trust into something controlled jointly by himself and Dustin, with me as a beneficiary rather than the owner. I read it twice at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning, the same kitchen table where I used to sit and do Reagan's math homework, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very clear, the way it used to go right before I made a difficult call on the rail yard floor, the kind of decision where hesitating costs you more than acting. Reagan, through all of this, said very little. She moved through the house like a woman walking through a dream she half knew wasn't real, agreeing with her husband in front of me, occasionally catching my eye for half a second in a way that almost looked like apology, then looking away before I could ask her about it. One evening I found her alone in the kitchen and asked her directly, "Reagan, do you actually want to be here? Or is this his idea?" She didn't answer for a long moment. "I want us to be a family again, Dad," she said finally. Which wasn't an answer to my question, I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice a missing signature on a contract. Not because it's loud, but because of the silence where something should have been. It was Dustin's mother who finally pushed me past the edge, a woman named Glenda who arrived 9 days in with her own suitcase and announced, without being asked, that she'd be taking the guest room overlooking the vineyard because the light's better for my painting. She redecorated that room within 48 hours. She moved my late wife's photographs off the mantel in the front hall to make room for a framed print she'd brought from home. I found them stacked in a closet face down, like something embarrassing that needed to be put away. That was the night I called my lawyer. Not the financial advisor, my lawyer. A woman named Yvonne Castellano who'd handled my wife's estate years before and had a way of speaking that cut through nonsense like a knife through warm butter. I told her everything. The trust documents Roland had drawn up, the numbered company, the conversations about the East Wing and the Vineyard wedding venue, the photographs in the closet. Harold, she said, has anyone signed anything yet? No. Then nothing has happened. Do you understand me? Nothing has legally happened. You are still the sole owner of everything. Tomorrow morning, before anyone is awake, I want you to call a locksmith. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to the house, Dustin's voice carrying up through the floor vents as he talked on the phone to someone about contractor quotes for the vineyard renovation, Roland's heavy footsteps in the hallway, Glenda's radio playing some classic rock station 2 rooms over, and I thought about the calendar on my kitchen wall with Reagan's birthday still marked on it in my own handwriting, 14 years of a date circled for a daughter who hadn't called. The locksmith came at 7 the next morning while they were all still asleep. By 9, the front and back doors of my house had new deadbolts, and the garage code was changed, and I'd had 2 movers, quiet professional men named Fitz and his partner, who I'd called the night before through a service Yvonne recommended, quietly load the suitcases, still mostly unpacked because they'd never really planned to live out of drawers. That was a temporary arrangement in their minds too, into the back of the rented SUV that was still parked in my driveway. When Dustin came downstairs at 9:15 looking for coffee, I was sitting at the kitchen table with Yvonne on speakerphone and a folder of my own documents spread out in front of me. "What's going on?" he said, and I watched the easy confidence flicker for the first time since he'd walked through my door. "You're leaving," I said. "Today. Your bags are already in the car, Harold." Roland started, coming down the stairs in his bathrobe. "Mr. Greer," I said, and I used the formal name on purpose, the way you'd address a man you'd just met at a business meeting because that's all he'd ever actually been to me. "You drew up legal documents transferring control of my assets without my authorization or my lawyer's review. My lawyer tells me that's worth a phone call to the Law Society, given the work you say you do professionally. I'd think very carefully before you say another word to me in my own house." Reagan came down last, still in her pajamas, her face pale. "Dad, what are you doing? What I should have done 11 weeks ago," I said, and my voice didn't shake the way I'd worried it might. "I let you in because some part of me has spent 14 years wanting you to walk back through that door. That part of me is still there, Reagan. It's not gone. But I'm 68 years old, and I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left being managed by a man I've known for 9 days, while my dead wife's photographs sit face down in a closet." Glenda, drawn down by the noise, opened her mouth to say something about the painting light in the guest room, and I held up my hand, and to my own surprise, she actually stopped. "You can stay in a hotel," I told them. "I'll cover 3 nights at the Pillar and Post in town. That's more generosity than this situation has earned, and after that you're on your own. Reagan, you and I can talk. Just the 2 of us, no audience, whenever you're ready for that. But these 2, I nodded at Dustin and Roland, are not welcome back in this house." Dustin tried one more angle, the kind of angle a man tries when he can feel the ground shifting under him. "You realize how this looks, right? Throwing your own daughter out for the cameras. People are going to hear about this." "Let them," I said. "I spent 40 years moving freight across this country without ever once cutting a corner because someone was watching. I'm not about to start being a coward now because you're worried about your reputation." They left within the hour. Reagan paused at the door, suitcase in hand, and for just a moment the performance dropped away and I saw something underneath it that looked almost like the girl who used to ride her bike down Barton Street, scared and uncertain and not at all sure what she'd done with her life. "I didn't want it to be like this," she said quietly. "I know," I said, and I did know. I think some part of her had wanted exactly what she'd said in my living room that first night, a family again, and had simply gotten swept into a current stronger than her own intentions. The way people sometimes do, the way I myself had been swept along for 11 days before I found the floor under my feet again. She called me 3 weeks later. Not Dustin's number, not a number I didn't recognize. Her own phone, the one I still had saved from years ago. We talked for 40 minutes. She told me she'd left Dustin, or was in the process of it, that the wedding venue scheme had been entirely his idea and Roland's, that she'd felt swept up and ashamed and hadn't known how to undo it once it started. I don't know how much of that is the whole truth. I'm 68, not naive. I know that people in difficult positions often tell you exactly the story that gets you back on their side. But I also know that grief makes liars out of good people sometimes, just for a little while, and that 14 years of silence is its own kind of grief, on both sides of it. We've met for coffee twice since then, at a place in Hamilton near where she grew up. Neutral ground, no suitcases involved. I haven't invited her back to the house. Yvonne says that's wise, and for once I'm inclined to take things slowly rather than all at once, the way I used to schedule freight. Not by hope, but by what the numbers and the evidence actually support. I still have her birthday marked on the calendar this year. I marked it myself, same as always. But this time, for the first time in 14 years, I think there's a real chance somebody's actually going to call.